And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. What a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas room already. Of course, tonight I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, I can feel it coming in the air tonight. Oh, Lord. Mm-hmm. And that's because today is a very special day. We had, of course, it's Edgar Cayce's birthday. The Sleeping Prophet was born in 1877. But today we got, at the end of the day, the JFK files. These are the JFK assassination files held back by the government, and particularly the CIA, since 1963. And it's very interesting because right at the very, very beginning there was a meeting that right after the assassination took place between the Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy, president's brother, and John McCone, who was the CIA director after Dulles got fired. And they met at the farmhouse there in McLean, Virginia. And somehow Bobby Kennedy put something into those records that the CIA wasn't able to blot out or remove. And if they did, it would have set off all these bells and whistles in the Justice Department. And that's why the files became such a political football all this period of time, because there's something in there which connects the CIA directly and the intelligence operations directly into the assassination of President Kennedy. And tonight we're going to get into that and the files themselves, which I was able to take a look at. They came out at the end of the day, but I was able to go through a number of them, and I found out that the PDFs weren't searchable, but I downloaded a few for us tonight, and we're going to take a massive effort to go through all of these files, which I think amount to actually 75,000 pages. But we're going to be looking for something very specific. We're not looking for a state actor, and we're not looking for, Oswald did it kind of things. We're looking for those steps that lead directly to the footprints of intelligence and aerospace in the assassination of the 35th president of the United States, President John F. Kennedy. Of course, we're going to be taking your questions tonight as well in the second half of tonight's program. And we'll go about an hour and a half, about 90 minutes with you on the special report tonight. And a lot of people are waiting with major anxiety all day because it was announced yesterday, and Trump said, it's all coming out, because he was at the Kennedy Center, which he's revamping, Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that Trump likes to do that, just like when he went over to North Korea and he was like, we really could build a nice bunch of hotels here instead of all those nuclear missile sites, using his realty charm on foreign leaders. And it is very interesting that I find in this JFK world that so many of the people who study the JFK assassination came out of a kind of a liberal mentality, because the liberals in that era, the 70s and 80s, fought against the war machine, fought against the Republicans, fought against the various wars, Vietnam, Iraq, and all the rest of it. And so it's very interesting to me that here you have a Republican president coming from the populist right, and he's the one releasing the JFK files, and all of these researchers who have hung their hat on the idea that, Trump is the bad guy and all that stuff, what do? So it's very funny the way these things spin out. You never know where that breakthrough is going to occur or come from. So it's always important not to be too politically dogmatic when it comes to the revelation of higher information. That especially relates to the UFO file, which comes up directly in the JFK assassination, as we put in our most recent documentary, JFK, The Final Speech, and that is the UFO file mystery. That's a documentary that's in the description of this video, and that's going to jibe a lot with these records. And I'm going to get into the records. There's one thing in particular that grabbed me, which was the memo from Arthur Schlesinger. And JFK researchers have looked for this for a long time. This is the memo for how to reorganize and basically defang the Central Intelligence Agency. And there are some very interesting observations in there, and this led to the famous National Security Action Memorandum 55 and 57, which basically throw all of the paramilitary, covert, clandestine activities of the CIA back to the military, in essence, taking the power to overthrow nations and all the rest of it away from the CIA. And many of these observations that Kennedy makes with Schlesinger in this memo. It's quite dynamic, and I think that they've held it back for a reason. One of the things that they say is, maybe we should organize our intelligence in a totally different fashion where we get completely around this idea of the CIA. And that, I think, is the beginning of problems there for President Kennedy. One of the most important things when you go through these records is the just getting out of the mindset of a state actor. It's so important. I emphasize this again and again. And I have one of the records tonight that shows that the CIA knew that Castro wasn't involved because they had an informant who was with him during the assassination, and he was really apprehensive about Johnson coming in and said, Kennedy, we had a deal with, he wasn't going to invade. We don't know anything about this guy. Well, you're not going to assassinate President Kennedy then and have all these misgivings about Johnson. So that's very, very clear. So many interesting things for us to go over tonight. This is Dark Journalist X-Series Special Report, the JFK Assassination Files, Bombshell release. And it is a bombshell. I think there's many things to be gotten through on it. So it's going to be a process here over the next few days of putting that together in earnest. But from what I gleaned already, there are some things that can open some doors up if we're looking in the right places. And that is more toward the intelligence, aerospace corridor, and the very, very dark group X-Protect working around the UFO file. These things become even more important when we start to get these releases in order to connect those dots and be able to go around the curves when it comes to the CIA and the way they were trying to paint things in the background. Oh, it was Castro. Oh, it was the mafia, whatever it would happen to be. I do want to mention also that if you're new here, you should go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter, but it keeps you in touch. And one of the interesting things about all the censorship that we see, especially around the JFK reporting that we do, because we link it directly with the aerospace corridor, which in general, the powers that be don't like that very much. One of the important things with that is it's a direct pipeline. And so once a week, you'll get this free newsletter. It has all the information about all the exciting shows we have coming up for you, and documentaries, live events, X-Series episodes, interviews with leading researchers and personalities. It's all there in the newsletter. So stand up and be counted. Go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter if you haven't already. I'm going to start off with something very interesting about a character named Eugene Brading. But before I do, Miss Olivia, you're up.
N8 Blank says, DJ has done an amazing job covering JFK, and Lever Action Gypsy says, I've studied this stuff along with UFO Nazi connection. I don't know of anyone more knowledgeable on this topic than Dark Journalist. Looking forward to listening to this unfold.
Oh, I really appreciate it. Well, look, I had a chance to interview the best, the late Jim Mars, and we would spend hours and hours on the phone beyond our interviews. And, he told me a great deal of things that I didn't know because he was a newspaper reporter there in Dallas during that period. So he really knew the ins and outs of what was going on. And he always went back to the fact that LBJ and J. Edgar Hoover were neighbors and close friends, and that is how the cover-up was able to be exercised. The actual assassination, of course, he leaned much more towards the Central Intelligence Agency, but he saw that deep state operation move. And, on the other side of things is Professor Peter Dale Scott, who I think is the greatest JFK researcher in terms of the deep state activity in the JFK research. And he's still with us. I think Professor Scott's 95 now. And he's still active. Amazing guy. And one of his books, which is Dallas 63, The First Deep State Revolt Against the White House, outlines how they put in a series of stories in case the first story of the Lone Nut piece got unraveled. And so they had waves of stories ready for when these other investigations and other things would happen. And the Mafia one is something that they had as a backup up their sleeve because they had used, the Central Intelligence Agency had used the mafia in all kinds of assassination activities overseas and apparently at home as well, and using them as, basically muscle. Now, and as soldiers in their cause, what's interesting also when we think about the Central Intelligence Agency is their relationship with the mafia goes back and further back. And in fact, they regenerated the mafia in Italy for the 1948 elections because they wanted to keep the communists out. And this is part of the meddling that goes on. And it's interesting. I see a lot of researchers who start with the idea that the organized crime mafia piece informs and blackmails the intelligence apparatus, and that everything's run by the mob and organized crime. And no, that's not the way it works. The way that Professor Scott describes the deep state, I think, is worth kind of a reminder here. Basically, the deep state is fundamentally on the bottom rung was organized crime, and then above that you had the intelligence agencies, and above that the contracting groups that the intelligence agencies could service themselves out to. So they would get all of this, intel and all the rest of it, but they'd be outside the bounds, really, of the CIA restrictions. And so they weren't as accountable. And these contracting agencies like Booz Allen Hamilton and others became the great surveillance arm for the Central Intelligence Agency. Above that, you had finance, oil companies, tech companies, and then the groups that manage that finance to form a core elite. There's your deep state package. And the idea, then you can't turn it all upside down and say organized crime is on top and blackmailing everybody. It doesn't work that way. So it's very important, I think, to keep those things straight when we get around to the definition of the deep state. It's also interesting to consider that the deep state definition is often used to suggest that we're talking about some bureaucrats who stuck around too long and, government equivalent of the DMV officials. Not at all. The deep state is a system, and it's a coalition of interests who get together to do a particular thing. They move using this secret system and step into the public to get a policy change. In the event of President Kennedy's death, there were a dramatic series of changes in policy. And so they'll come into the public sphere, and the public state has to deal with it. And then they step back out, and we're left with their footprints, and you're left with 62 years of searching for why the Central Intelligence Agency kept the records. We're going to get into that tonight, why they kept these records and which records that we're actually looking for in this huge document dump that we got from the national security establishment through the voice of President Trump and his national Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard. This is a great way to start off your career in as the director, as the DNI, Tulsi. So hats off to you. So I want to rewind the clock here just for a minute so we understand and get some bearings about why there was such a clash between the CIA and President Kennedy. And that's going to take us all the way back to Joseph Kennedy. And that was John Kennedy's father. And it's very interesting because, of course, being the president was the goal of Joseph Kennedy, who, saw his relatives coming over from Ireland and facing a lot of heavy duty prejudice right here in Boston. And he strived to be a cut above everything. He got into Harvard. He wanted to get into all these elite clubs. And he ran his own bank at 26. I mean, this guy was a mover and a shaker. But he got particularly involved in the 20s in the stock market. And the stock market was a real rogue's game in the 20s. And that's where you got the Depression with all the high-end speculating that was going on. And he also, during Prohibition, of course, ran massive operations, bringing in 250,000 pounds of alcohol from abroad into America. And so that set his fortune for a long time. But an interesting thing happened with Joe Kennedy when the Depression hit, is he realized the possibility of revolution in the streets because of the way that the government was not taking care of the people. And this spawned in him this idea that I've built all this stuff up. Is it going to be for nothing? And then it dawned on him that a rising tide lifts all boats, and he went into a totally different way of looking at uplifting the culture, and his children got that. And, but along with it, they got all the street savvy, smarts, and you might say the street smarts of Godzilla in the case of Joseph Kennedy. But Joseph Kennedy, because he was in charge of the SEC, he knew where all the different stock things and who the traders were and who the big companies were and the Rockefellers and all the rest of it and where their bodies were buried. So he was a very interesting player. And as he got closer and closer to FDR, FDR kept a close eye on him in the kind of saying, well, you keep your enemies closer. And by 1940, Joe Kennedy, who had been appointed the ambassador to the UK and took his family over there, including a teenage John F. Kennedy, who learned from all the English diplomats and everything else how the game really was played in geopolitics. By 1940, Joe Kennedy was starting to turn against FDR and was considering running for the presidency himself. And this is where part of his trouble came in, because when they were talking all about, how we should move against Hitler for World War II, Joe Kennedy said, well, maybe we should find a way to negotiate with them. I don't see England winning against, the German machine. So therefore we should find a way to work with the Nazis and all that. So because of that, his entire political ambitions got thwarted. And then he turned his attention to his oldest son, Joe Jr., to become president. And Joe Jr. had, all the calling cards. He's well studied. He went to Harvard. And he had a certain amount of charisma. But it was John F. Kennedy, interestingly enough, who really had that sense and the idea of what a president could do. And he wasn't even interested in politics. He wanted to be a journalist. So when Joe Jr. dies in the secret mission on his way into Europe carrying these munitions, the plane blows up. Now, I think that there could be a lot of sabotage with the Kennedy family because there's an awful lot of plane crashes and, of course, many assassinations. And in fact, 3 of Joe Kennedy's 4 sons, he would outlive 3 out of 4. I mean, that's pretty incredible when you think about it. And so we have a very interesting setup there for Joe Kennedy pinning all his hopes on his son, John F. Kennedy. And John F. Kennedy had such a sense of world politics and world responsibility and, the entire idea of a rising tide lifts all boats. So by the time we get into 1946, Joe Kennedy has said, you've got to get into this game of politics now. Your brother's gone, and if anyone's going to do this, you're the one. And so John F. Kennedy switches from being a journalist to being a politician, and he wins his first congressional seat at 29 years old right here in Boston. And he'll serve in the Congress with all kinds of interesting folks who will show up later, like Nixon and all the rest of it. And then he learns so much through time that by 1952, he takes on the Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, and he wins. And, they had held that Senate seat for many, many years. So this is a remarkable thing. By the time he runs for the presidency in 1960, he's already had 16 years of great experience of dealing at very high levels of government. He's seen it all, even though he's only 42 when he's running for president. So we get kind of a snapshot there of him going in, and also the incredible money behind the Kennedys. And the fact that John F. Kennedy said, if I have an ideal for this world and I'm not beholden to anybody, then I should be able to implement it through our democratic republic system. Central Intelligence Agency had their grip on the world since World War II. And they had, through the figures of Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles, his Secretary of State brother, they had really formulated a worldview. And they'd created an entire new world order. This was the path that they were on. And when Kennedy shows up, he's a complete disruption, but he's like a force of nature because they can't avoid him. This guy who's incredibly charismatic, incredibly smart, has great policy ideas, and the kind of money, the kind of money that the Kennedys had back then is like, it's like Bill Gates money. I mean, they were the billionaires of their time, even though they were millionaires. And we have to look at them in that kind of echelon. That group on the elite side, we're looking at them and saying, they want everybody to succeed. They want freedom to rule worldwide. And they're kind of traitors to their class in that sense. So that gives us some kind of background that by the time President Kennedy gets in, which the Central Intelligence Agency thinks Nixon is going to win, so they're not prepared. I mean, they're always prepared, but they're not quite prepared for President Kennedy coming in. And what they do is they adopt from their psychological profile the fact that Jack may need a father figure to guide him through foreign policy activities, and they select Allen Dulles in this role. And he, feeds him all this sugar and honey about the Cuban Bay of Pigs operation and how it's going to be very easy and the public will rise up and throw out Castro and all the rest of it, which was the great focus of the CIA at that point in 1960. And when he realizes, later after the Bay of Pigs happens, there's this incredible scene with his aide, Arthur Schlesinger, and he's golfing and he said, how could I do it? They were lying to me, so bald-faced. How could I believe them? So he fires Dulles and he fires others inside that intelligence apparatus who were really sacred cows in the institutions. So instantly there you have him operationally against the Central Intelligence Agency. And this is going to make great strides because he's operating against them, but ultimately it's going to cost him his life through the assassination by the Central Intelligence Agency of our 35th president, President Kennedy. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X-Series Special Report, JFK Assassination Files, Bombshell release, and President Trump keeping his word, as it were. We're going to go through some of those files and show that fingerprints of intelligence on the assassination and how this secret has been kept by the deep state for some 62 years. We're going to turn to your questions in the second half of tonight's program. And like I said, we'll go about another hour with you here. Before I say anything else, you're up.
Rebecca Romilay says, Jefferson Morley just posted that 7 of 10 files sought by JFK researchers are now in the public record.
Yes.
But that release doesn't include 2/3 of the files promised or the 2,400 recently discovered FBI files.
Yeah, that's interesting. I want to know where those 2,400 FBI files are, since they had just discovered them. They weren't part of this. We're going to be seeing a lot of this. That Schlesinger memo about reorganizing the CIA is one of those documents he's referring to. The question is that I wasn't able to get an answer before showtime was, are there any Joannidis files? And I didn't see them in my scan, but if they may be there. And Joannidis comes up tonight. He's actually a crucial figure in the middle of all this, because he's the one that links in aerospace directly with the JFK assassination through the figure of UFO touting Deputy CIA Director Bobby Inman. And their story is so core to the research around these files that I don't think anything can supersede that, because when we get right down to it, President Kennedy was assassinated over an advanced exotic technology. And that goes to the aerospace side and the entire NASA setup, which was so crucial a piece of his presidency. What else you got?
Also, Rebecca Romilay, Guy Bannister's files put Dinosaur, Strategic Air Command, U.S. missile bases in Italy, General Edwin Walker, and JFK assassination under the same code 15 through 16. They must have all been connected.
Yeah, that's in my documentary, X Protect the UFO File Assassins. And what happened, I actually have that. It's funny you mentioned that. I have that book here with me. It's Let Justice Be Done. And this is a book that's just going through the nuts and bolts of the Garrison investigation. Garrison accidentally stumbled into an aerospace, Nazi, and UFO link while he was investigating the assassination of President Kennedy. That's quite a triple threat. And Guy Bannister, of course, comes up as well. And there are Guy Bannister files here. I haven't seen the full piece yet. I'm going to go back to 2013 which was the 50th anniversary of the JFK assassination, and there were all these specials and things that were going to happen. And right in the middle of that, of course, we had the terrible Boston Marathon bombing and all the strangeness around that. But one of the things that took place during that bombing were all these explosions, of course. But right in the middle of those explosions happening, a very strange thing took place, which was the JFK library went and had a huge explosion. And everyone reported at the time, NBC and everyone else, this is related to the Boston Marathon bombings. If we go into this a little bit, it's very interesting, and I'm going to show how it relates to what I call stealth archives, these files that are right out there and right out of our hands. Suspicious fire at Kennedy Library remains under investigation. These were the headlines at the time in relation to this. Another view of the damage done to the JFK Library. Did a fast-moving fire at the JFK Library, which erupted at 3 p.m. Monday afternoon, have any connection to the deadly bomb attacks on Boylston Street that took place just minutes before? Here's another one. Suspicious fire at Kennedy Library remains under investigation. April 17th, 2013. Probe continues late into Monday fire. Another view of the damage to the JFK Library. It's a question to which no definitive answer has been given at this point, but federal and local investigators continue to scour the presidential library for clues, even as much of the nation's attention remains fixed on the carnage in Back Bay. Quote, it's a suspicious fire with a particularly strong accelerant, said one person briefed about the investigation within city government. Police and fire are not ready to declare that the fire and the bombings are unrelated. Given the timing and the intensity of the fire, it's suspicious. I'll tell you what happens about 2 hours later. They're instructed, no. You can't bring this up. You can't talk about this. You cannot say they're related. Dial it back. And we still have some local reporters who didn't get the word on that, and they're getting stonewalled by the people in charge of the library. And at one point, the woman comes out and she's speaking to the reporter and she says, it's a very minor fire. It's nothing. And the guy turns the camera and there's this huge plume of smoke, black smoke, billowing out across the whole scene. Now, right in that period of time, the JFK Library was holding all these takes of the different tapes that Jackie Kennedy made with a journalist right after the assassination in 1964, William Manchester. And they're kind of the stealth archives of the Kennedy family. There's a lot more. But in 2013, just before actually, in 2011, there was all these plans for this very salacious miniseries by ABC that they were going to put out. And it was said, well, they're going to put all of the Kennedy sins, on the record. And it was this miniseries, ridiculous nonsense. And so what happens is Carolyn Kennedy goes to ABC and says, look, I have these tapes. My mother didn't want them out until 75 years or after her children had passed away. So I can give you those tapes early, and you won't run that salacious nonsense miniseries. And they agreed. So Carolyn Kennedy was going to give them the tapes. Now, the person at the Kennedy Library who was transcribing the tapes, or somebody she knew or something, leaked the contents of the tapes because she thought, oh my God, this is going to come out and it's earth-shattering. Secret tapes revealed Jackie Kennedy believed Lyndon Johnson was behind the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And this is what was leaked along with a lot of other details, and it was reported everywhere. Shortly after President Kennedy's assassination, Jackie Kennedy recorded a series of tapes. And so those tapes were at the heart of all this activity. Very shortly after the fire and all this stuff, we get the Carlyle Group rescuing the Kennedy Library from financial failure after the fire and all. And we all know the Carlyle Group and their close association with the Bushes. It's a weird combination. Now, I want to say this about the library. It's one of the best library museums you could possibly want. And they've always been incredibly helpful to me. So the staff and all the people there are fantastic. I'm talking about kind of upper echelon stuff that goes on in the background. And also, as you know, especially if you've been watching the HOTZONE episodes that we do, the largest container of information about Ernest Hemingway is actually at the JFK Library, not some Ernest Hemingway museum. It's there at the JFK Library, and we explain why in our research on the CRAZE in the HOTZONE. It's the latest documentary on that. But I want us to be aware that there are a lot of things around the assassination that have hung out there, and at times I think have been used as poker chips, on the deep state side and against the deep state side for a long time, including the fact that when President Trump, in October 26, 2017, was mandated by Congress from 25 years ago, a law, which was the JFK Records Act, the CIA came in and used every pressure that they could through Mike Pompeo to make sure he didn't release these files that we got this time around. So there is something core in these files that we are going to bring to the surface that's going to really be something of an earthquake if we can thread it through properly and point it where it needs to be pointed at these higher echelons. So that's what we're going to do tonight, and we're going to do it with your help as well. By the time we hit the weekend show, we're going to have many more of these files as well. I'm going to read from some of them tonight, but before I do, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Krusty B23 says Anna Paulina Luna just announced a JFK hearing for April 1st at 2 p.m. and is asking for anything that should be flagged for her attention, posted to X.
Oh, yeah.
Also, David Termina says, DJ, I asked Grok if Joanides appears in the files, and it confirmed that he does. It says that it shows he was connected with Oswald in New Orleans.
Yeah, well, look, Grok only goes so far. So, I don't know. I haven't seen that yet. And I do think that there's a way to process this information in such a way that some of those tools can be helpful. But Grok also scans the web. And so there's a lot of information about Joanides available out there. So, let's see, if somebody has the file, share it. Because the files are downloadable. In fact, I have downloaded them all, but I'm still, because they're not searchable, I'm running them through a software program to be able to search terms, which is going to be crucial. Since we're talking about Joanides, let's meet Mr. Joanides, who is quite formidable in the center of the JFK assassination and in the documentary of the JFK, the final speech that I have on this channel. Joanides was the CIA's top psychological warfare expert, and he was tasked with creating the Oswald project. This is the nature of the operation. So that thing that needed to be put across, that they needed the patsy for, that they had to set up Oswald as the commie who had been to Russia and wanted to, destroy the system and all the rest of it. All that was laid out by Joanides over very careful psychological warfare. But instead of using psychological warfare the way it's normally used by intelligence agencies, which is against other countries, they were doing it against the citizens of the United States. This is the nature of the problem. So we get into a lot of interesting territory with Joanides. The first thing is that no one even knew that he existed. And the other thing is that President Kennedy, during that period leading up to the assassination, he was taking on this aspect of the overreach of the Central Intelligence Agency and their psychological operations. So when you get the top psychological warfare officer, he has a real sort of deep goal in making sure that his operation is not a failure. And he sees it as a very personal thing because the CIA wants to go into Cuba. They have a series of things around the world, Laos, Vietnam, and everything else. But what's crucial is that this idea that the intelligence agency sees themselves as the leader and they only want a puppet in the White House. And so Kennedy comes in as somebody with his own ideas, his own policies. And it's interesting, there was an aide to Allen Dulles who, was working with him on the Warren Commission and would go out and drink with him after they had done their research for the day, and Dulles would throw back a few drinks and talk to this aide and say, you wouldn't believe that Kennedy, he thought he was a god. He thought he could really set the world on fire. And he said, all these series of things. And the guy was completely stunned, thinking, oh, what a grudge that Dulles holds against Kennedy. How is he investigating his murder? So we get that hint there in the background that the CIA is just looking to usurp the power, which is why Professor Scott calls the Kennedy assassination the first deep state revolt against the White House, because here the deep state had done a number of things, but they hadn't gone against their own president. This was new. And in the case of John F. Kennedy, for them, they were thinking, this is a matter of our survival. Now, when we talk about Luna's committee, which is the Committee on Declassification, I think that there's some things that could be accomplished there. And I want to put it in context, because you've had a number of investigations after the Warren Commission about the JFK assassination, the Rockefeller Commission, the Church Committee, a series of them. The Pike Commission, which nobody ever talks about, and their records you can't get till 2050. Very, very deep research into intelligence in that committee. The House Assassination Committee and the Assassinations Record Review Board in the 90s, all of this stuff. So you get these little windows, and you get a number, a lot of information comes on board, like Operation Northwoods, we learned through the 90s file releases for the Kennedy assassination. Now, when we get a period like this where there is kind of a cleanup crew, you have to really take advantage of that and get what you can in terms of declassification, because actually a lot of things can be reclassified if you get the wrong administration in. And as we've seen, only a few months ago, we had the wrong administration, and we had to put up with them for 4 years. Mr. Otto Penn Stepford Biden himself. But this is the interesting thing. When they go back and they do these committees, the person that they're sending to liaison with the public and to work with the committees and their lawyers and all the rest of it is Joe Anides. Now, the thing that the Kennedy committees asked for is someone who was not operational and had nothing to do with the CIA operations in 1963. And the CIA says, oh yeah, no problem. George Joe Anides, he's your guy. This is very interesting because, of course, he was operational and he created the Oswald project. So he's doing a double role here, which is he's feeding the congressional committees the little things that they think are great revelations or whatever, but he's keeping the hidden hand of the CIA carefully behind the scenes in all this. At the end of his life, he gets the Career Intelligence Medal for achievement, which is rare. And it's never explained why they gave him the medal. Well, it's for a lifetime of service and all the rest of it. But he did something very important. On one side, he created the Oswald Project. But the person who gives him that award is Bobby Inman. Bobby Inman, Deputy Director of the CIA, Admiral, former NSA Director, and one of the few top officials who's ever talked on record about the UFO file, saying, quote, not only do we know what the crafts are, we know who's flying around in them. To researcher Timothy Good in 1991, and was part of an effort. Now, Inman, I've pointed out before, is still alive and is somebody that Luna's committee could subpoena to put under oath to get some straight answers about why did Joe Anides get this Career Achievement Medal? What was it there that he was aware of that he had done? And that can open up the connection between the JFK assassination and the UFO file, which is a crucial aspect involved in the heart and the center of these records releases, or else they're going to have another 60 years of people chasing their tails about Cuba and the mafia and all the rest of it. And that's nonsense. So are state actors, Russia, Cuba, Israel, that's all nonsense. In this case, what you're looking for is a small group protecting a very, very high-end source of technology that had not been revealed to the public, and that is the group XProtect. I'm going to get into them next and read directly from some of these files that'll corroborate what I'm talking about here. But before I do, You're up, Miss Olivia.
Jim Roy says, already one file fingering, quote, a small clique within the CIA was responsible for the assassination, unquote. Tim Houston says, what role did James Jesus Angleton play? And Lancelot Link says, E. Howard Hunt confessed to his son that LBJ was in it up to his eyeballs.
Oh, absolutely. And the thing about LBJ, you know, he was headed to prison because of the Billy Celestes scandal and because of the Bobby Baker scandals. It was over. And Nixon, who was in Dallas that morning, he's talking to a reporter, and he says, everyone knows that Lyndon will be off the ticket in 1964. It was common knowledge in those circles that LBJ had become a liability for Kennedy. And they always had an animosity, but in his back pocket, of course, was J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director. So it's this very uneasy dance that Kennedy and LBJ do as president and VP, because LBJ thinks I should be president because I was Senate Majority Leader and I have all these connections and all the rest. And, you know, it's interesting because there's a friend of LBJ's who asks him, you know, why do you want to be VP? You don't get to do anything. As Senate Majority Leader, you're the most dynamic man next to the president, you know. And LBJ says to him, oh, Kennedy's not going to live through office. And, you know, the guy was thinking, oh, maybe he thinks that Kennedy's health or, you know, something like that. Well, so LBJ knew very far in advance the possibilities. And when we look at LBJ, though, we can't say that he had the ability to organize the entire operation and pull it off. That doesn't work. He's the man who, when, you know, the limousine turns onto Elm Street, he's the one who's really in trouble in all of this, because he's going to be off the ticket and he's going to be facing prison. And it will be Bobby Kennedy that have given the nudge to legal officials to go after him, because he sees what a problem that he is and what a criminal mastermind. It's funny, a lot of people don't point to this tape in doing traditional histories of LBJ, but there's a tape on record of LBJ saying that, no, it's Bobby Kennedy saying about LBJ, you know, this man is a perverse animal. That was Bobby Kennedy's opinion of LBJ. And he said he just eats people up. So LBJ was a very dark character, knew that he got to be able to stand in if he played ball. But the people who go in for the LBJ did it thing, you can't do it. You have to remember that it takes the deep state apparatus. Who are the best people that we have in the government in 1963 who do assassination? It's the Central Intelligence Agency. And their animosity towards the Kennedy presidency goes on for 3 years there. It's a struggle the whole way through. Part of that struggle is about having the UFO file not under executive control. This is part of the problem, and it's something that Eisenhower warns Kennedy about when he gets into office. He says, these guys are basically taking off with that technology. You have to somehow get it back under executive control. And the former presidents after Kennedy's assassination are very aware of who it was that pulled it off, and all of that points to the Central Intelligence Agency. I want to say that someone who does come up in the records is Eugene Brading, or Jim Brading, as he's known by his other alias. And there's a couple of files on him I want to read, but I want to say this about him, which is that he has a very unusual footprint in all of this, and that he's connected with intelligence, oil people, Ruby, and David Ferry. So he's somebody, I think, that is going to get a higher profile from looking at some of these documents. And the fact that the Ruby aspect is important because it was never solved in that whole period of time. And of course, Ruby ultimately smuggled out a letter saying that it was a conspiracy and that it involved, intelligence. Now, one of the very, very strange things in the middle of the Eugene Brading story is that in something called the Gemstone File, which is kind of like the leaks of its day. There's a series of things that come out. It's this incredible rant, really, with all these facts about how the government developed the drug trade, the Kennedy assassination, and Onassis. And it comes from this very interesting guy who had worked for Howard Hughes and felt jilted by them and wanted to spill all these secrets. And he gets this out through a journalist. One of the things that he says about Brading I think is very interesting, and I'm going to read it here from the Gemstone file. And he's talking about the triangulated ambush of the assassination. And he said, the third point of the triangulated ambush was supplied by Eugene Brading, shooting from Kennedy's left from a small pagoda at Dealey Plaza across from the street from the grassy knoll. Brading missed because Roselli's shot had just hit Kennedy in the head from the right. Brading's shot hit the curb and ricocheted off. Brading was photographed at the scene stuffing his gun under his coat. He wore a big leather hat, its hat band marked with large conspicuous X's. Police had been instructed to let anyone with an X-marked hat band through the police lines. Some may have been told they were Secret Service. Now, this show, of course, is all about X-steganography, and X is this symbol that they've used across a number of different things for advanced technology, but it represents the secrecy as they move that function through different government agencies. This is an actual shot of Brading at the scene with the X's in his head. Let's see if you can spot those. I mean, it's quite remarkable. So Brading was allowed to go through, and we get this kind of gift from the past in the Gemstone file about this. And it says here that a sheriff rushed up to Brading, assuming he was Secret Service, and told him he had just seen a man come out of the book depository and jump into a station wagon. Brading was uninterested. Brading walked into the Daltex building to make a phone call. There he was arrested by another deputy sheriff, and he showed him a Jim Braden driver's license and was released without being booked. Here's an interesting thing. You have all these people who show up and get arrested or moved around or whatever in Dealey Plaza. It's like everyone knows this is all going to happen right there, and they're all there on hand for the show. Now, in the case of Braden, it's interesting because he was going to have a meeting with H.L. Hunt, who was the oil billionaire and kind of the king of Texas. But the same afternoon, in his date book, Jack Ruby also has a meeting with H.L. Hunt. So they're both in there in the morning, and the assassination is in the afternoon. And so when we're looking at that right off the bat, we have strange connections with Brading and Ruby going to see Hunt. And Hunt, it's very interesting because he was somebody who was using, for his own intelligence agency and his own intelligence apparatus, he had hired on a private basis General Galen, who was the Nazi we brought over here to help us run the CIA when we first started out, because the idea was, well, this guy ran intelligence for Hitler, and, you know, we might as well use him to beat the Russians. But that martial philosophy of Galen and other Nazis definitely seeped its way into the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, I don't want to say, and sometimes people say, well, you know, America got all the Nazis and we became like a Nazi country. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying there's a small group that was involved at the very top who had this intelligence influence. You know, if you go into Russian politics at the time or previous to that, with people like Stalin or whatever, I mean, if you said the wrong word about the government, they just throw you in a gulag or something. And after World War II, of course, the Russians got their fair share of a paperclip style program as well. So everybody was just doing this. It doesn't make America bad for pulling in those guys. What I'm more suggesting is that bringing in that team to run the space program gives them a motive, and they're still working on this kind of Nazi martial philosophy when it comes to ruling things on the ground from space. And I'm going to show how that plays into these assassination files as we open them up tonight. And this, of course, is the big day where the JFK assassination files come out. And we're going to sift through them all the way till the show on Friday. And we're going through them and making them searchable so that we can get the particular type of information. But this is definitely a breakthrough, regardless of how people see the release, or whether anyone thinks that the CIA would keep anything that was detrimental to their own position in their own records. It is the tracks of those records. It is the connecting the dots from the records, because predominantly many of these records, even today, the ones that came out are going with this, Lee Harvey Oswald and his spooky Russian connections, which is a total red flag from the very beginning. Now, before I go any further, Europe.
Mike says, some interesting things so far I've seen. ZR rifle, the blueprint for the organization. Definite smoking gun, but I don't know if that was already released before.
Well, it was. Okay, that's we have a lot of information about ZR rifle, but whenever we get additional information around it, and I was looking at the ZR rifle piece, which is all about William Harvey and his activities. One of the interesting things about what ZR rifle did is when they chose a patsy, it was very good for that patsy to be associated with going to some foreign country that was an enemy of the United States. So you can see in the outline of ZR rifle how to do the perfect crime of removing a top official and blaming, a patsy that has a known record, or can easily be painted as a communist. So I think that particular file could be exciting, and I do feel like there's a few things that already have come to the surface that might start to open up this picture. Again, it's not a smoking gun style situation, because I don't think anyone expected that. However, when it comes to the files of Joanides, for example, Joanides is somebody who was left off the record. He was rediscovered by this Washington Post reporter. And it was an accident, basically. It was somebody who was associated with this Cuban revolutionary group called the DRE, and they kept something of a payment router form in their basement in Miami. And this came out through checking the name Howard, which is what the name that he used. And they were able to track back this Howard character directly to Joanides. And it's interesting because Joanides, in setting up the Oswald psychological operation against the public, it's his group, the group that he's funding with many thousands of dollars per month. And they're the ones who immediately, when the assassination happens, run a full-page ad saying, this is Lee Harvey Oswald. He's a friend of the Cubans. He is pro-Castro. He's the one who did it. And it's really pushing the Oswald guilt thing right away. So we can see, if you check the record there, that this all goes back to Joanides. But then we find Joanides involved in blocking the congressional hearings in the 70s and 80s on the JFK side. He's the liaison, and he's not supposed to be. And then finally, when we see Inman giving him his achievement award, Inman's being so close with the UFO file, are they basically saying, when they give him that award, thank you for saving the UFO file by coming up with the perfect plan to assassinate President Kennedy? That is how this thing could really blow up in Luna's committee and the D-Class committee with Tim Burchett and the rest. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is JFK Assassination Files Bombshell release. We'll be going through a number of these records, and I've already downloaded all the ones that are available. There may be more coming. I don't believe that's the complete run, because somebody else mentioned that the FBI files are also coming out. But many of the files that we were looking for are there, and it's a matter of sifting through that information and pointing it to the right places, which is going to be crucial, as the disinformation is going to swirl and swirl heavy to try to get back to either that one safe story, which is Oswald did it, or maybe say, hey, Russia, they were the ones that did it, or the mafia, which of course, it's always funny to me because there's so much good information in studying the mafia, but not in studying them for having done the Kennedy assassination, because they simply weren't capable of doing all the things and the cover-ups that were so crucial on the government side. And so it was definitely an entity inside the government. And that's the crucial piece. That's the awakening that we can go into 2025 with if we play our cards right and get the records pointing in the right direction. What else you got?
Okay, Rebecca Romele says, Pippa Malmgren just posted an article saying her father, Harold, told her he believed JFK assassination tied to Operation Bluegill Prime and Curtis bombs away LeMay.
Yes. Well, Malmgren, I talked to Malmgren before he passed away, and he was a real, top aide to JFK on the national security side. And he told me that he was briefed by Richard Bissell on otherworldly craft, UFOs. So Bissell was doing these briefings in relation to it. He was very clear that he wasn't involved in the program of, working on the UFO file or anything, but that Bissell was the key man. And he also talked about the involvement of LeMay in this. But in one of these nuclear tests, and it's very interesting because this came up around Operation Dominic, which we did an episode about Lloyd Berkner and all that Ripple technology in last August. And then right after that, the story about another Operation Dominic test, and what happened during that was during the nuclear test, they shook up a UFO, and it was on screen there. And then they had another incident that he mentioned where President Kennedy went to Los Alamos to get briefed on the UFO incident. So the UFO part is a big aspect of the history around the Kennedy presidency. It's not documented because that's how they do the UFO file. It is completely in the hands of the covert Expertech group. So you can't expect to get a regular trail of it, but we've put a number of things on the record about it. I've mentioned last week that we, of course, classically in the past did our interview with Douglas Caddy, who was best friends with E. Howard Hunt, and that Hunt told him in private that Kennedy was assassinated over the UFO file because he was going to share it with Russia. This is the crucial piece. That's the thing that we need to keep in mind, that so much of the craziness that takes place in relation to the U.S. and Russia has to be understood on this level, which is they don't want those two major powers to get together at the top and just talk back and forth. They want them to go through the CIA and all those deep state channels. So when you see Trump going to talk with Putin, as he did today, and they had this conversation about Ukraine, it's very interesting that you talk to Russia on the same day that you're releasing the JFK files. I think the timing there is quite remarkable, and I encourage those conversations. I think they should have, a summit and all the rest with Putin and Russia and end the war in Ukraine, which is just a boondoggle for the defense contractors and who else? It's some strange interface there between those who create the war situation and then those who manage it for them through the political process. This was what President Kennedy had seen, and he realized it was a manipulated process, and he was trying to end this endless activity of war towards Russia. Now, in that period, you had a real nuclear flashpoint going on. But of course, we come up to a World War III type scenario anytime we clash in regular war with Russia. And so we need to dial that situation back dramatically because, in the words of President Kennedy, we can't afford to risk fighting a war where even the fruits of victory will be ashes in our mouth. And, it can't be laid out any clearer than that. But what else you got?
Lancelot Link says, was Majestic 12 involved? Also, Rebecca Romele says, Harold Malmgren's daughter just wrote today in a Substack post, quote, when he passed, my dad said, we, guardians of the MJ, more than once, and not just to me, she says JFK knew about UFOs.
Yes, it's very clear, and it's going to become, if we can take this process to its logical conclusion, which is what we've been trying to do on this program from the start, the UFO file is at the heart of President Kennedy's assassination, including the fact that Oswald when he was leaving the Riley Coffee Company, he said, I'm going to work for NASA. Aerospace is all over. Aerospace and the UFO file is interlaced and just hanging over the assassination. Guy Bannister, who was the person that Jim Garrison said was the most important person in his entire investigation into the murder of President Kennedy, he's the person who coined he's the original UFO researcher for the FBI. And he went all over the Pacific Southwest investigating those cases. And there are all these newspaper shots of him in Oregon and Idaho and all these other places investigating those cases. Well, it's also interesting that Garrison was in the FBI at that time. He said, oh yeah, we did a lot of field assignments together. He knew him very well. So, there's a UFO underlay around this whole thing, and you can't get around that. I do think that in terms of Pippa Malmgren, here's what's strange. Now, Harold Malmgren, I wasn't familiar with. But Pippa Malmgren, I did an entire episode about Pippa Malmgren in late 2022 because I thought, isn't this interesting? Here's this woman who had been part of the sort of George W. Bush brain trust, and she's talking all about, UAP and all this stuff. And I said, that's interesting. I would consider this kind of a neocon move into the UFO space. And then it turns out she was very, very well informed because her dad was Malmgren, who came out. Now, he had a huge cancer illness, and he decided when he came back a little bit healthier that he would put a number of things on the record. And so we talked, and we were going to do an interview. And I feel that there was still something in him. It's very interesting. He would tweet things out like, Kennedy went to Los Alamos or whatever. He'd send me messages, DMs and things with this information in there. But there was still something reluctant about him. He was still a little bit like he didn't want to go all the way in, but he was hoping there was enough of an opening for him to do it. So Pippa, as his daughter, inherits a lot of that information and knowledge. I'm curious to see where she goes with it, but certainly he was absolutely the real thing. The next thing I want to do is read actually from the memo, which is the memo of Arthur Schlesinger about how to break up the CIA, as Kennedy was like, I want to break the CIA up into 1,000 pieces. How do we do that? This is the memo, and JFK researchers have been waiting for this memo since, the assassination, really. And so this one they always held back, and you wonder, because it's just a series of suggestions about how to change things at CIA, but they didn't want it out. So I'm going to read a little bit of that as well. I wanted to read the Cuba piece as well. This is a quick one. Now, this is their own high-level CIA contact, a high-level Cuban diplomat in Western Europe who has been a reliable reporter of political and economic information. Quote, Fidel Castro was very upset over the United States, the change in the United States administration brought about by President Kennedy's assassination. The top Cuban leadership was sure President Kennedy would not invade Cuba, and they were convinced that the policy of his administration for economic blockade and internal subversion against Cuba would not overthrow the regime. The present policy of the Cuban government on orders from Castro is not to attack President Johnson in public or do anything to irritate him. According to Cuban government leaders, Castro wants to wait and see what President Johnson says and does about Cuba. This isn't somebody who would be responsible for the assassination because he doesn't even want him in. So I think that's a good, that's one of those documents hanging out back there that's just useful on the surface. Here's a little more on that. A lot of people, when this story broke, I think it's because Zero Hedge mentioned the Gary Underhill story. Gary Underhill's story is very fascinating. And it is in part of these records, but it's been out for a long time. He was an electronics expert who did all this work for the intelligence agencies, and he comes home one day to his wife in Long Island and says, the CIA killed President Kennedy. And then he flips out and he takes off. And there's a few kind of interesting background points. I'm going to read a little bit about Underhill here since he came up today, but I do want to make it clear that Underhill's story has been out there, I think, since about 1975. So that's not a big new revelation in the records, but it is in there, and it is worth it to pursue him as a lead. So Underhill was born in Brooklyn on August 7th, 1915. He graduated from Harvard in 1937 and served with military intelligence. After leaving the OSS, he worked on specific projects for the CIA. He was military affairs editor for Life magazine. After the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, Underhill told his friend Charlene Fitzsimmons that he was convinced that he had been killed by members of the CIA. He also said, quote, Oswald is a patsy. They set him up. It's too much. The bastards have done something outrageous. They've killed the president. I've been listening and hearing things. Remember, he's a surveillance expert. I couldn't believe they'd get away with it, but they did. This is the nature of the problem, which is the CIA got away with the assassination of President Kennedy. And all the follow-ups and all the, it's like everyone knows, which is why you had so many committees investigating the atrocities committed by the Central Intelligence Agency for so many years. Everyone seems to know that this thing is out of control. And, if we think for a moment that, oh, that was their bad old days and now they're good, look, they've never been reformed as an entity. And this is part of the problem of governance. And one of the things I think it's important to note about the Central Intelligence Agency is as recently as a few years ago, they were planning the assassination of Julian Assange. So, they're in the business of it. Of course, they rigged the Ukraine election in 2014. I mean, they're still doing everything that they ever did, except bigger and badder than ever. And back here, we have Underhill saying, I couldn't believe they'd get away with it, but they did. Underhill believed there was a connection between executive action and the death of Kennedy. They tried it in Cuba and couldn't get away with it right after the Bay of Pigs, but Kennedy wouldn't let them do it. And now he'd gotten wind of this, and he was really going to blow the whistle on them, and they killed him. This is important because President Kennedy was against executive action as a way of doing change in a country. He didn't want to see leaders assassinated. So when the CIA assassinates the DM brothers, for example, 3 weeks before Kennedy is assassinated, it rings very big alarm bells for him. But this was the game, this was the season of assassination that they were engaged in at the time. So when we hear about this Underhill story and the very strange things that happened with him, and that story comes out, it is a good story to follow up on, but everyone remember that one actually came out a long time ago, so we do know about that. More files. Are you ready? Mm-hmm. What do you got?
Matthew now says, LBJ was deep ducking in his motorcade car before the first shots were fired. This comes from one of the motorcycle cops riding alongside the car he was sitting in. St. Cruzen says CIA with mafia shooters. LBJ knew what was going down.
Yeah. Oh my God. That
it's undeniable.
The Secret Service didn't have to do anything there. He was already hitting the ground. It's weird, we have the film of the Secret Service stand down right at Love Field, and that they're getting, thrown off the back from riding on the back. Of course, if they were riding on the back, then you'd never have the assassination go down the way that it did. So there was security stripping right in the beginning when we look at the Dallas trip. And I mentioned the continuity of government players involved, and Professor Scott, really stakes a lot on the COG players being involved in every deep event in history. And you can't get around it, factually. But in the case of President Kennedy, there's two. There's Jack Crichton and Winston Lawson. Winston Lawson was the person who set up the motorcade route. and he was the Secret Service agent who did all these things with Kennedy. And he lied repeatedly to the Warren Commission about the sequence of the shooting and everything else. But when Professor Scott went into his background just a little bit, he found him as part of this COG continuity of government network. And that group shows up again and again whenever we get around the deep events of history. John Dean was a big member of COG, and he's the one who pulls down Nixon during Watergate. Of course, Oliver North, George Bush Sr., all these people, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, they're all architects of COG, and they're always involved right in the heart of these various things. It's very interesting to me because when you get around 9/11 in particular, you are looking at the activation of COG. And they went into that emergency status on 9/11, and we have never come out of the emergency status. Every year now, the president, when he signs off on the National Defense Authorization Act, as Biden did just before he left office, it says continue the series of operations as part of the emergency operations for September 11th. We're still under that, and that brings us closer to that continuity of government window. That's the danger. And I'll tell you, they just did a segment on 60 Minutes, which included our friend General Guillot, who is, of course, the COG combatant commander if they ever flip the switch. And in the meantime, he's the commander of NORAD. And, this guy, as the commander of NORAD Northcom, which is an illegal military encroachment on the United States, Northcom, NORAD, and the COG combatant commander, he's a triple threat. He's going out there and he's talking all about the drones. And I exposed the fact that when they were doing all the major New Jersey drone activity, which the independent media dropped the ball on heavily, really bad reporting. They were going along with this mainstream thing saying, hey, people are just imagining things. Come on, let's get real. When you get around to it, you're looking very much at the COG people, were running tests. And the thing that it was called at the time was Homeland Synchronization. And he came on there on 60 Minutes and he was like, we weren't ready for all these huge drone swarms that were happening at Langley and all the rest. He's like, we have to get control of our skies. There's a COG plan heavy, waiting in the wings, and it all includes a sky event. And I've put on the record that I think it's a UFO threat. That's what they're going to use for it. And that's why I think all these people are there. And I have to mention this as a little aside. That movie I've been mentioning just came out, and it's called Age of Disclosure. And it's a complete deep state version of the UFO file. And here are all the spooks at their own premiere. Isn't that great? So you've got Spook there, Spook Gary Nolan, who works at the CIA, Spook Jim Semivan, and all the rest of the spooks. You got one admiral there, Tim Gallaudet, but he believes everything the CIA tells him. And of course, Hal Puthoff. But it is interesting to me that, this is their new approach. And Dan Farah in the middle, he's the director of the movie, and he is Lou Elizondo's booking agent. So, and he got him the book deal and all the rest of it. And that's what he wants to do. So this thing it's like the fantasy version of UFO disclosure. It's CIA weird fantasy. Yeah. What do you got?
I'm going to make a comment.
Yeah.
And I don't know exactly how I'm going to put it, but I have noticed that there are some people in the chat who are extremely opinionated.
Oh, yes.
And about what went down, who was responsible.
Oh, sure.
And what we saw with the UFO file disclosure attempt is that they knew exactly how to fracture the UFO community.
No question.
And they very successfully did it. And I just think there's an opportunity here for the deep state to fracture the JFK research community right down the middle.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Even in more pieces than that. And I just suggest that we don't take the bait. We
Yes.
all want to get to truth, and we should play nice with each other, explore, debate in a friendly
No
way,
question.
and don't stick too closely to our little theories. Be able to listen to each other and learn. Okay, because
Oh, yeah.
I'm even seeing fracturing in the ideas room, and I won't have it.
No, certainly not. And here's the thing, one of the greatest examples of this is a lot of people who've studied the deep state, you'll know certain sites like Spartacus or the Education Forum, all these different deep state forum. And these people have traded great information for years. And they've been studying this for a long, long time. And it's part of what they do. And it's funny because the JFK stuff is finally getting the attention that it deserves as the crime of the century that it was, and the intelligence agency ousting their own commander-in-chief. But I saw on those platforms before this was in vogue, because you remember my first documentary on the JFK assassination is 2014, Agent Oswald, the CIA patsy. So I've been doing this a little while too. The interesting thing is, in that education forum, they had so many blow-ups about different people, and I think that they would send people in there to splinter it, the way that they did the 9/11 research community. And of course, the UFO field was easy. It was a bunch of authors who had been neglected in their work and felt shortchanged. And so the CIA came along and said, hey, you get your own Netflix series. So, you have to be careful with that. When you deal with dark journalism, the first thing you put on the table is that counterintelligence is active in all of this deeper research, because you're going outside the bounds looking for important information. And one of the things, the rules I adopt for dark journalism, is that you have the official story, which the institutions promote, and which the media reports, and that's JFK was killed by a lone nut and all that stuff. Then you have the secondary story where these different researchers, writers, professors, and other people say, hey, it didn't happen like that. And, we have these different sources and different evidence. And then that's really a lot of dark journalism. Then there's the third level, and the third level is the junk conspiracy. And the junk conspiracy gets fed out, and you hear, the driver did it and all that kind of stuff. So Jackie did it, or, Israel did it. When they pull you into the junk conspiracy, then it's a problem, because you realize, oh, people are looking at that. What happens inevitably is they go back to be safe to the official version, because just thinking outside the box, there was this good volley of info there with the alternative researchers, but then the same people who promote that official story are the ones who float out the really wild theories. And the theories that are junk, you can see them a mile away when it comes to a number of these different things. You remember the famous thing with COVID about the rattlesnake venom or and all that stuff. You have to be able to sift through what the op is versus what the junk conspiracy part is.
I still don't know what to believe there.
No way. Okay, well, we have a number of really good examples of junk conspiracy, and so I think that's a good point that you made, though. Yeah. What else you got?
Okay, Zach Robinson says, what are Gigi's thoughts on James Jesus Angleton, as he likely had access to MJ-12 files? Some of the docs mention him scrubbing the connections to Israeli intelligence significant. So everyone is asking about Mossad.
Well, you in any intelligence situation, you have awareness and activity. French intelligence did their whole research on the JFK assassination. You have Russian GRU intelligence, KGB. There are all kinds of intelligence agencies around these deep events. There's no question about it. All of the really great researchers that I've known, from Professor Scott to the late Jim Marrs and others, they don't have Israel in the middle of the JFK assassination. And I did a show actually on the whole Dimona thing and how the Israelis wanted to keep their nuclear program, and President Kennedy wanted to make sure that there wasn't a runaway arms race in the Middle East. So there are a number of things there where there was back and forth and negotiation, but nothing that rises to the level of assassination. You have to know that if you're the Central Intelligence Agency and you are, the group inside that agency that has pulled off the assassination, you want people to pick up state actors. There's a very convincing book about Madame New in Vietnam being involved in the assassination, because they didn't want their drug trade obsession. Look, there's a lot of objectives and motives that people can have, but when you move to executive action, how do you get the Secret Service, the media, the government, medical authorities? How do you get them all to go along with your program of assassination? That's executive action. That's what the CIA were good at. And if the case were the clean-cut case that it was supposed to be, this one guy with a lucky shot and an old gun and magic bullets and all that kind of stuff, then they wouldn't have needed the cover-up, But the cover-up has sustained to this day. And today we had a huge break in it. And all we can do is use that information and go deep and connect up the things that we've brought forward. And those trails will lead you directly to the intelligence community and the aerospace groups that are dealing with advanced technology in the UFO file. That's where the assassination goes. That's the foundation of the research that we do. And we've looked and incorporated so many of the elements in the different shows that we've done. So, I think it's important. That's the thing that's been covered up here. By the way, where do you see such a cover-up like you do around the JFK work? You saw that cover-up for years around the UFO file. And it's only recently that they came out with the CIA-friendly disclosure version. So that's who's running the game there. It's all about that advanced technology because of the incredible advantage that it gives them. Here's the point. Robert Sarbarker, the top physicist now in America in that period, he said the UFO file was classified above the nuclear secrecy. So you can imagine the level of secrecy that's on for those groups. And if you are a president and you're thinking, I'm going to share this information around the UFO file with my Russian counterparts, there's a huge apparatus that hits the ceiling, and you'll have to peel them off the ceiling to make sure that doesn't happen. And in the case of President Kennedy, I think they were able to say, he's a national security threat because he wants to do this, and, he's going to basically turn the world red if he does this. So let's make sure that he doesn't get an opportunity to do it. And, there's a number of things where Kennedy was challenging the establishment, mostly because he was independent and he understood what they knew. This is another reason why a number of factors and people in the deep state resist President Trump as well, because President Trump, through Roy Cohn and through his uncle who worked on the UFO file and the Tesla files, he's too much on the level playing field with them. And so they are absolutely determined to remove President Trump. And they tried to remove him even from coming back in during that assassination season that we had in July and August. So, you're dealing with a very deep echelon of power there. Yes. What do you got?
I'm not familiar with these. Nutter Butter wants to know, because DJ elaborate on what he knows about Project Aquatone and Project Gateway and how it relates, if applicable, to the JFK assassination.
Well, I believe Gateway was a drug study, but
I've never heard of Aquatone.
Yeah, that is interesting. I'm gonna have to, if you have some information on that, you can email it to me at admin@darkjournalist.com. This is a couple of things that came out. Now, there are Garrison files here that I'm looking for because there were 16 Garrison files that were part of this. But Garrison was mentioned in this one, and it was about Jim Brading. So I'm just going to read this briefly. This is, as shown in the previous account of Jack Ruby's very substantial ties to the mafia, Ruby was particularly involved in the syndicate areas of gambling and narcotics. And influence, I would say. But beyond the multiplicity of evidence which indicates that Ruby and Brading were both important mafia figures operating in the same general areas at the same general times, there's another single piece of evidence which places both Ruby and Brading at the same place the day before the assassination. Evidence indicates that both Jim Brading and Jack Ruby visited the Dallas offices of H.L. Hunt. Now, this is a a JFK file from the Church Committee. And this is their deep dive on Ruby. Now it's safe after the Warren Commission, because the Warren Commission was just like, oh, he was an upset, bartender, ignoring all of his massive ties to the mafia and Cuba and everything else. Evidence indicates that both Jim Brading and Jack Ruby visited the Dallas offices of H.L. Hunt Oil Company on the afternoon of November 21st, the day before the assassination. Just 24 hours before the president was murdered. Obviously, any link which places Brading and Ruby in the same place at the same time the day before the assassination does, of course, raise further significant questions about a possible relationship between the two men. Now, I'm going to tell you something else that's weird about Brading. And there are a lot of interesting Brading files in the middle of all this. Brading is also present at the Ambassador Hotel. And that's 5 years later, when President Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General and the Senator from New York, is assassinated there. And, he's in attendance. So Brading gets around. He's present at both assassinations, and he actually gets arrested at one of them. Evidence indicates Jim Brading received permission from the U.S. Board of Parole in Los Angeles to make a trip to Dallas, Texas on November 18th, 1963, 4 days before the assassination. Brading was required to report all of his travels to his parole board following his parole in 1959 for the embezzlement conviction. So you can see that this is somebody who was moving, through kind of like doing phony oil deals in places like Colorado. And he's moving between these powerful forces of the mafia and also the CIA and the oil companies. So there's a weird, he comes up as a figure that we can say is sort of, we can see through him into the deep state. And they mention things in addition about Marcello there. This is the farm where McCone met Bobby Kennedy, and Bobby Kennedy put something in the records that we're getting, which is why the CIA has held them so long. The question is, we need to be, have the ability with all the research to sift through and find what was it that Bobby Kennedy left in those records that the CIA couldn't take out. And, that President Trump said, if you saw it, you wouldn't believe it. That's the thing that we need to sift through and find out. And I'm sure we'll have a great jump on this for you by the time Friday rolls around with our next show. But what else you got?
Lancelot Link says Joseph Miltier was photographed on the sidewalk along the JFK's parade route. You want to touch on that?
Miltier is weird because he's picked up on a recording before the assassination talking about how you would be able to assassinate President Kennedy by going up into an office building with a high-powered rifle. And their informant is saying, really? They have plans to do this? And he's like, oh, yeah, it's in the workings. It's going to happen. And then there's a picture of him in Dealey Plaza. And then he dies in a fire mysteriously just a few months later. Very strange. A couple of notes.
That's always suspicious as hell, right? When somebody's eliminated like that.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, in the Kennedy case, this is what's so strange about the Kennedy case, which is whenever they would do another version of them. So you had all these weird deaths associated with the Warren Commission. And, when they got an actuary to figure out the odds of all those people being dead within 7 years, based on, their age and everything else, the actuarial came back and said, you know what, this would be actually 100,000 trillion to 1. Those would be the odds of those people all being dead. And you see that incredible list at the end of the executive action movie of the way that they died, karate chop, mistaken for a deer, and all the rest,
Right, your blood runs cold.
Oh,
watching
yeah.
that at
No
the end.
question.
It's incredible.
And so for me, what I did is I investigated all the other JFK congressional hearings and investigations. And there were always huge deaths associated. It was a huge death list associated with just the committees. So by the time you get to, the House Assassinations Committee, Sam Giancana gets killed before he talks to the church committee. Johnny Roselli gets killed. George de Mohrenschildt, Oswald's handler, the oil geologist, the kind of cultured man who seems, why is he hanging out? Why is this millionaire hanging out with $1.25 an hour Lee Harvey Oswald? Doesn't really add up, does it? And his disintegration is something else, I think. He even goes to the psychic Crozet. And Crozet immediately sees him and says, oh my God, you're associated with this whole thing.
I'm sorry, who goes to Crozet?
George de Mohrenschildt, yeah. He goes to the psychic Crozet. And it's interesting because Willem Altmans is the actor. He was the reporter who uncovered all this. He was a Dutch journalist, and he's the one who plays de Mohrenschildt in the JFK movie. Try to deal with that. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is the JFK Assassination Files Bombshell release, and it certainly is. Remember, what we're looking for very specifically is the links between the Central Intelligence Agency and the aerospace companies in the murder of President Kennedy. And there are a number of different factors that show how the government was run in that period. But something about the files, of course, you're always going to have a limited view with documented evidence because nothing of this nature goes into a document. However, there was something in these records for the CIA to keep them for 62 years and to avoid the admission of their complicity in the assassination of President Kennedy and what the reasons were. So it's through that angle, that lens, the wide angle lens of that research that we can get somewhere with this as opposed to just looking at historical documentary evidence. Now, I mentioned to you that the Schlesinger memo was one of the documents that they've held back for 60 years. And researchers have wanted it. There's a couple of things in here I'm going to read where they recommend how to rebalance the picture of the CIA. The CIA's trouble can be traced to the autonomy with which the agency has been permitted to operate, and that this autonomy is due to three main causes: an inadequate doctrine of clandestine operations, an inadequate conception of the relationship between operations and policy, and an inadequate conception of the relationship between operations and intelligence. This memorandum also suggests ways in which some of those problems can perhaps be alleviated. And this is now the president's aide writing to President Kennedy. And what he's getting at here, and it's, the document itself is over 20 pages, but I'll just grab a couple of interesting bullet points. And I think that there is something powerful in here because it's Kennedy's moves to restructure the agency that are a direct threat to two things: to that deep state apparatus, but also to that breakaway space program. And there, the folks deep in the NASA setup, von Braun and others, those people who are vested in a rule the ground from space policy are also extremely threatened by Kennedy's moves to get rid of the Central Intelligence Agency and reorganize it, because that's their nest of power. And, many of those guys, since we brought them over, the advanced scientists through Paperclip, this is how they've been operating. So Though the CIA's autonomy developed for historical reasons, it's been able to endure because there's no doctrine governing our conduct of clandestine operations. The problem of doctrine for CIA is the extent to which its various clandestine missions are compatible with a free and open society. It is idle to argue that because the communists can do such and such, we are free to do it too. Communism is a creed nurtured in conspiracy. The whole point of communist social and political organization is to make conspiracy effective. If fighting fire with fire means contradicting the freedoms traditionally enjoyed by Americans in order to give more freedom to the CIA, no one seriously wishes to do that. Yet I do not feel that we have tried rigorously to think through the limits through which the maintenance of an open society can place on this secret activity. Until this is done, CIA's role will not be clearly defined and understood. The problem which must be faced is what sort of secret activity is consistent with the preservation of a free social order. And there's many things in this memo, and you can see that Kennedy adopted this as his philosophy. This is how we're going to get rid of the CIA. It's not compatible with a free and open society, and it's not a constitutional entity. And so here he was writing NSAM, National Security Action Memorandum 57, which says, let's bring it all back, and we're going to push that power of the paramilitary operations, clandestine operations, that whole bit going into other countries with secret forces, special forces. We're going to throw that all back to the Joint Chiefs. Now, Fletcher Prouty worked as the intermediary between the CIA and the Joint Chiefs. When he gets the National Security Action Memorandum, he gives it to the Joint Chiefs, and they look at it, and they are afraid to tangle with the CIA, so they shelve it. So President Kennedy's sine qua non, his major piece, the thing that he wants on top, this is his vision. And the problem is he's not able to put it on and put it across because the Joint Chiefs themselves don't want that war with the CIA. And it's a very interesting thing to note that President Trump activated NSAM 57 just before he left the White House in 2020. And it was supposed to be activated on January 6th. And I'm sure that the Biden administration, as soon as they got in, got rid of it. But this was the nature of the struggle of the Kennedys with the deep state, and particularly the Central Intelligence Agency, where, after all, Kennedy had fired Dulles. The problem was Kennedy's vision for how to bring about a new world. They already had their vision. It was already activated and in place. And so this is the nature of the clash. Their version was basically right makes right, and the might makes it right attitude, the Marshall philosophy carried over, and they grew and they extended. But remember, when we're talking about the CIA, they really are that element that's connected directly to this group of elite power brokers. That's the problem here, because you're not even talking about a constitutional agency. They are representative of this international finance world. And that's why, a quick example is, this oil company wants to set up in Uzbekistan, but they're worried because they're like, the political situation is such that strongman could get in there and all the work we put into those oil fields could be nationalized. Those guys take over. So the CIA goes in there and they set up the situation. So it's a very friendly thing to Exxon or whoever. This is the nature of the problem. And that's where we got into incredible problems with Ukraine. And in the case of the Biden administration and the whole Obama push to put us right on the doorstep of Russia and through NATO and everything else. It's a very disastrous policy, and pulling back from it, as the Trump administration is attempting to do, is exactly the right move, whether you're right, left, center, or indifferent. Getting us out of the mess of the Ukraine war and having it, first of all the money that it's cost us, the $350 billion since when did we have money to do that? But this is how this exposing of the Central Intelligence Agency can really change the ruling system in the country. And that's why I think having Gabbard, having Ratcliffe, having Patel really does make a difference. I think that's a remarkable cabinet. We'll see what they do. And we'll definitely, after the first 100 days, we'll really have a sense for what's going on, say around May 1st. But I will say this, that so far the moves are exactly on. And I'll tell you this, in terms of the JFK researchers that lived and died, looking for the government to fess up about their involvement in the assassination of President Kennedy, this is a remarkable day regardless of how people rank the records release and the files therein. And we're going to get into those files and have a show for you on Friday that will be based on trailing those leads directly from the aerospace UFO file threat aspect into the assassination through the records released by President Trump and his Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard. Before we go, Miss Olivia, what else you got?
Let's bring in Australia for a minute. Petrified Palace says Australia contacted the CIA before and after the assassination, asking them not to release certain records, reported by Australian News. Want to talk about Pine Gap, where that fits in?
Yeah. There's a lot of things there. What's interesting to me, I was trying to get this quote in here. What's weird is when I was talking about in the last episode, which I highly recommend everyone check out, the previous episode was all about Judith Exner. And Judith Exner was this remarkable, aspiring actress who became friends with the Hollywood set and married an actor. And then after she divorced the actor at a very young age, she married him at 18. I think they got divorced when she was 23. She got into that whole Hollywood set of Sinatra and everything else. And Sinatra set her up with President Kennedy. And Kennedy used her as part of his human intelligence network, as I went over last week, trading and exchanging these envelopes. And one of the envelopes were with Sam Giancana. And one of the things that she was trading in those envelopes were blueprints for advanced aerospace craft. Well, the FBI was watching her apartment because of all this activity, and they saw two guys break into her place. And what happened was they didn't take any money, but they were looking for something, and they didn't take jewels and all that stuff. So it turned out that the two people who had done it were the twin sons of I.B. Hale, who ran General Dynamics. And General Dynamics were all involved with who was going to get these TFX fighter contracts. And that was a truly high-end fighter plane that we had at the time. And what happened was all of that TFX fighter, work, the really kind of X technology they were incorporating into it, moved on into Pine Gap. And so that's where you get the direct connection between the things that were taking place there and the development of Pine Gap. Not only is it a super secret facility, but the sightings of UFOs over Pine Gap are remarkable. And I've heard people from Alice Springs, who've emailed me on this program whenever we've covered it, and they have remarkable stories of Apotheum and the UFO file in Australia, which of course the people in Australia are very, very familiar with it. Yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
The chat's a little messy. So Joseph Tuga says, Defense Industrial Space Command? ?
Oh, yeah.
You want to talk about DISC?
So DISC is ultra secret and is something that the CIA would have a hard time fessing up to. But this was something that came out through the work of the Torbett document. And the Torbett document was kind of like WikiLeaks. It was like the Gemstone file, but the 1970 version. And it tracked very carefully the Garrison investigation into the murder of President Kennedy. And it went into this various details about how the CIA had worked against the Garrison investigation. And in fact, about 10 years later, the assistant to Richard Helms, who was the CIA director at the time, went on record saying that he would want daily updates about the Garrison trial and how they could help Clay Shaw, because Clay Shaw, who Garrison had put on trial for the murder of being involved in the conspiracy, he had been working for the CIA, but that wasn't disclosed at the trial. So, all these things, these people end up, if you look back on the situation and the things that happened, they were right on the money. And Garrison was one of them. Fletcher Prouty, of course, was another one. And I'm, very glad to quote him from time to time, because he said in the re-release of his book in 1997, The Secret Team, that they always needed a boogeyman, and that the CIA had dressed up communism as the boogeyman, and the CIA was going to dress up terrorists. And, they had worked through these whole different facades, but now he saw that they were building up UFOs and aliens as the next big threat. That's Prouty, who worked on the top levels with them. So when you hear us here talking about COG and the UFO threat, we're on very solid ground, interestingly enough. And it's not a comforting thought, but it's something to keep an eye on for sure. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is JFK Assassination Files Bombshell release, and it is a bombshell release. We'll have more of it for you on Friday, and we have just a couple of things left for you here tonight. What else have you got?
I'm going to tell everybody to take it down a little bit, okay? Because, the getting upset, I'm saying this is, I'm like super emotional, but, it wastes a lot of energy. You're getting emotional doesn't do anything. It's not a productive thing. Right? It's natural, but you don't want to waste that precious human energy, your passions, right?
Oh, no question.
Use it for something constructive. That's all I'm going to say. All right.
I saw a document in there about Marita Lorenz, and she's come up in a couple of our episodes. Of course, the CIA had tried to convince her, because they knew she had dated Castro, to go there and kill him with poison pills and stuff. But they really made her life a living hell, and she was closely associated with people around that really black ops that the CIA was running, including Frank Fiorini, a.k.a. Frank Sturgis, who I found out had attempted to bump her off in the mid-'70s. It's a weird thing about Sturgis, too, which is that he gave a confession to a cardinal about being involved in a team that was involved in the Kennedy assassination. And they had used him, the CIA had used him for all kinds of operations, including Castro taking over Cuba. So it's so funny that they turned against Castro, because they were with him for sure. But there was a file in there on Lorenz. So I'm going to just read this briefly because COG comes up. As the result of an article on the subject in June 1976 New York Daily News, COG was asked to do a file check to determine whether the subject was ever connected with the agency. According to an LA COG desk check IP trace, CIA and security office check, Marita Lorenz has never been employed by the agency. Of interest, however, is the fact that her sister, Valerie Lorenz, was granted a CSC in July of 1955. There are several references sourced to the FBI. Lorenz is a self-admitted former girlfriend of Castro. She claims that she met Fidel while on a trip to Cuba with her father, captain of the North German, Lloyd, in February of '59, became infatuated with Fidel and stayed in Cuba. She served as Fidel's mistress and came to the U.S. with Fidel's party in April 1959. She learned at that time that she was pregnant. She returned to Havana a short time thereafter and had a miscarriage. She claimed she was drugged. Because of his reaction, she turned against him. Lorenz came back to the U.S. from Cuba in December of '59, and the CIA basically tried to convince her to do this, and she went back but couldn't pull it off, basically. And from there on, it's very interesting because she is around with the black operators, and she said that Oswald was somebody who was working for Alpha 66, which is the group that was trying to take out Fidel Castro. And she said he was with us. So there was a German friend of hers, a researcher, and she was going through photos with him. And there's just a photo of her with Oswald and him dressed up, in a uniform, training for Alpha 66. And he said, look, that's Ozzy, as they called him Ozzy. And she said, oh yeah, Oswald, he was with us, If you go through that record, you're going to find that Robert Kennedy, as soon as the assassination took place, contacts this Harry Rodriguez, who had worked in the background on Operation Mongoose and all the rest, and was a big anti-Castro guy who was over here and really wanted a second attempt to take Cuba back. And Bobby Kennedy calls him up right after the assassination, and Oswald's name is flashed all over the place. And he said, they're saying one of your guys did it. So he knew who Oswald was. So, it's very interesting when you look at this, that Oswald was in the middle of a number of deep political forces, probably working basically as a triple agent. And so in tracking him, going to the Soviet Union in the first place, and then coming back with a Russian wife, and then going to Dallas, who is it that he's spending all this time with when he goes back to America, to New Orleans? He's with Guy Bannister. So Bannister becomes a major linchpin in the middle of all this, because Bannister is connected directly to the UFO file. And, somebody that close as the former chief of the FBI in Chicago, that close to the CIA, which he did all this work for the CIA, in New Orleans, hiring Oswald, shows the complexity of Oswald's position in all this, but also shows him again around what? Advanced technology. Just like at Tsugi in Japan when he was there working with a high security clearance on the U-2. So the story, as we're told it, has nothing to do with reality. These people were all dealing with very, very high-end technology, and that's where a lot of the spy game was coming from, along with the political intrigue. And the moon mission was coming up, the UFO file. Kennedy had asked, he sent the memo 10 days before his assassination to the CIA director and said, I want all the high threat cases so we can share them with our Russian counterparts so there isn't any problem. So if a UFO flies over one of their nuclear bases, they know it's not us. This is a crucial aspect. CIA director didn't want to do any of that stuff. That's 10 days before the assassination takes place. We have to, and the Luna Committee with Burchett and all the rest of it need to look at this, the UFO file aspect directly with the JFK assassination. That's where this story is going to lead us. And with that, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Peter Ness says, make note, just before Trump did the first release, I think that means in his first administration, after reading it, Space Force was formed.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Space Force and Star Wars 2, which is the Iron Dome project, are two attempts deep in the Trump administration, part 1 and part 2, to retake the UFO file from this weird, shadowy, not quite corporate, not quite government entity. So it's some mix, it's some shadow play between the two. And Trump is doing the only logical thing, which is this is how you get it back. If you have a division, a defense division that's in space, then anything that is flying around up there becomes directly under the commander-in-chief. So this is how you reclaim that executive privilege of handling the UFO file. And this is what JFK was after, and it's what Eisenhower warned him about coming in. But JFK had the background through Forrestal, family friend, fellow Catholic, very close to Forrestal. Forrestal objected from the start to the secrecy of the MJ-12 group around the UFO file. Gets thrown out of a window at Bethesda Hospital. And, Kennedy got that message, of course. And there's the famous picture of him as president visiting the graveyard of Forrestal and making sure that the pictures that are being taken for the unknown soldier, he takes them and guides them over with the photographer to the cemetery of Forrestal and takes the picture. And that's in the last year of his life. So Kennedy has to be seen as a remarkable figure, somebody who was taking on the establishment on so many levels and leveling the playing field. Because, there's a number of things, of course, about him issuing the silver-backed money. And that's a direct hit on the Fed and the things that they were doing at the time. And that power has only grown as we saw it grow worse and worse and worse. And by the 2008 bubble, they were packaging up, bad mortgages as credit, which could swallow up the entire world economy. So we're in a very tenuous situation dealing with the deep state. And I think the only thing that they suffered was a loss in the election. And, for them, it's an interim. And I do feel that trotting out the COG commander to talk about the threat from unknown drones is part of the sky event activity. So we're in very, very deep territory in a study of the JFK assassination files, which have been held by the Central Intelligence Agency, and only through the effort of this president are we seeing these. It's a massive change. It's a massive switch. And I think that there are going to be little details in these records that are going to bring around that deeper aspect of the X-Protect group and their involvement with advanced technology as the root cause behind the assassination of President Kennedy. Yes.
Lever Action Gypsy says exactly why Trump created Space Force and partnered with Musk. It's deep state UFOs from S4 and Area 51 versus U.S. Space Force and SpaceX.
Yeah, well, I leave the door, open with Musk because Musk, of course, he's not allowed to talk about UFOs, so he's always taking the position that they don't exist and all the rest of it. But he has the obsession with getting to Mars and setting up a colony there. Of course, as we've pointed out, this was predicted by the major paperclip scientist, Werner von Braun. And he wrote a book in 1948 about it. What are the odds of that? So, and somebody could say, well, didn't Musk's dad say that he knew about the book and that's where he got the name? Well, I'll tell you what's weird about all that, which is Elon had a grandfather named Elon. So, it's more about the psychic aspect of Werner von Braun coming out of this genre of creating rockets for the Nazi program, the V-2 rockets using slave labor at Peenemünde, and with Walter Dornberger, who's also involved in the JFK assassination because the person that Lee and Marina Oswald are staying with, Ruth Payne, her husband is Michael Payne, who is the protege of Walter Dornberger, who was what? He was sentenced to be hung at the judgment of Nuremberg. And he was saved by von Braun, who said, I can't do the rocket thing without him. He was my boss. I need my team. So he saved his life, and Dornberger came over here and became the general. He was the CEO of Bell Helicopter, Bell Aerospace, and Michael Payne, whose wife lives with Oswald and Marina, Payne is just hosting them, and all of the evidence in the public that convicts Oswald in the public arena comes directly out of the Payne household. So how can anyone who's looking at the situation honestly miss that link in the heart of this to Dornberger? Yeah.
I love this comment from Ratboy Genius. I'm starting to think that if the JFK murder is ever solved in the public consciousness, it will be much easier to put a finger on everyone who is trying to kill us. I think this is key here because it's not just about JFK. It's about a system that we're operating under, that we're all subject to. They're all victim of. And that's the real thing, is exposing it.
Yes.
Starts to collapse the system.
Oh, no question about it. It's, when that sunshine comes in, the darkness flees. And you have to, in a situation like this, where you have these forces, with things like the COVID op, with things like the UFO threat op, they are trying to consolidate humanity, and they are hoping to centralize the power structure to such a degree with the technology that humanity does not even have a chance to stand up against it. And we've teetered very, very close, and I'm afraid we're still in the teeter on that. I wanted to mention, of course, D.H. Byrd in relation to this. And in my documentary, JFK, The Final Speech, the UFO file mystery, he comes up as a very significant figure in all this because of all of his association with Antarctica, which is the sort of the development place, of the advanced technology. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But the fact that he's the cousin of Senator Byrd, who controls all of NASA's funding, the fact that he's the cousin of of Admiral Byrd, who goes to Antarctica and creates these kind of various expeditions and colonies, the idea that when Kennedy is going past the Texas School Book Depository, or when Oswald is punching the clock, that he's working for a guy and going by a building where the owner of the building is the cousin of the famous Antarctica explorer, and he's the CEO of Ling Temco Vought, the experimental aerospace company. You've got aerospace everywhere you look in the Kennedy assassination. That's where to look. That's where the Luna Committee, the D-Class Committee can go. It is right into the heart of it, which is Byrd, Antarctica, and the UFO file. It is, there's so much evidence for it, and there's so much of a trail for it, that would be kind of the enlightening piece in the middle of all this. We already know that there were multiple shooters, and it's nice to put those things on the record, but you don't need to spend a lot of time on that. It's just who was behind the assassination of President Kennedy, and the Central Intelligence Agency, along with their allies, and the Expertech Group. That's where we need to go and look for this. And with that, Miss Olivia, your last question.
Okay, I'm going to pair these two. Poppy Capu says, I'm convinced after years of reliving this, it's as you say, DJ, it's bigger than we can possibly think.
Yes.
And Robert Scott says, it's amazing how little we know about the Trump assassination attempts, even in this modern day. We haven't come very far since JFK's assassination.
No, not at all. I mean, part of the things I think that are coming out about the assassination patsies is very important, because there's a lot coming out, and I think in these files we can enjoy that they will display this idea that Oswald, the CIA knew all about Oswald. In my opinion, he was working directly for the CIA. But the thing about it is now it's on the record. So even 20 years ago, you could have said it and it would have been one of those theories that were out there. Now we know that in 1959, they were opening his mail. It's on the record. Now we know the name of the officer that was in charge of sort of checking his mail, following his trail, and keeping on top of him, surveilling him. And it's weird because that very same guy, when he goes over to Russia, he has a UFO incident. So that's a little bit interesting too. But so we know for a fact that the CIA had a relationship with Oswald. The next question is, why did they use him as the patsy? And I think the fact that they had got him into Russia in the first place to do some kind of surveillance game with the Russians, that he became more and more of an ideal opportunity. And the fact that they had previous patsies set up in Chicago, in Florida, there were other attempts, but Texas became the perfect storm for them. It was the perfect combination of ingredients, because with Lyndon Johnson, with John Connally and all the rest of it, they could control the flow out of Texas. This is crucial, where the crime was committed. And that's how you get things like the botched autopsy at Bethesda, because they were able to take the body and, steal the brain and all the rest of it. That's where you get the entire misinformation story. But it's interesting. You see how it unravels after 62 years. And it's interesting because think of the people and the researchers who lived and died doing it, right? And your grandparents and parents who went through it. It's very interesting to me because it's an intergenerational thing, and it is one of the greatest crimes in the American system that has ever happened. And I will say this, that in the heart of the action of setting up the ambush is the continuity of government group. They're in the heart of the Kennedy assassination. So the overlap there with the intelligence people in a group that operates by emergency powers has to be looked at. That's why it's important to look at it today when you have people like General Guillot giving interviews, who's the head of Northcom, and when they flip that COG switch, he's the combatant commander of the United States, and he assigns regional governors until things are safe enough for us to have an election again. This is very important for our thinking around this, because their end game ultimately has to be such a centralized control. And they've realized on a few occasions, in the last election certainly, that they don't have the ability, when the game is played fairly, to govern with a majority. So they need to do something else. And what you do instead is you go to emergency powers. That's the threat. That's the danger when you get around not knowing these things. And so the Kennedy situation, the Kennedy assassination, the story is very instructive for us in the 21st century, but clearing the record so that humanity and all the world knows what took place and how an intelligence agency took out a sitting president because of the forces that they represented, who are still in the shadows with the work that they do. That is historic, and that is what we can do. We can push that entire agenda and move it forward so that people can see what really took place, and that'll give us a whole different vision. That's how you know you're right in the middle of the heart of things, and that is a very worthwhile endeavor. Yes.
Moonshot Media says 30,000 more files just dropped.
Yes. Yep. This is the nature of the thing. I knew once we got to that point that they weren't going to leave it there. So we're going to go through all of them, and we're going to work a lot with various researchers and people that we know on this. We'll come back to you on Friday, and we'll come back with some new revelations from these very important files, the JFK files that were released today in a historic action by the National Archives under the instructions of executive order by President Trump to his Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard. What a day. What a day indeed. And with that, Miss Olivia, your last question, what do you got?
I'm going to give it to Fooper Fighter. It says, I think this is like one of those scientist blackboards that has thousands of mathematical symbols on them. You won't be able to tell what they say until you familiarize yourself with the whole subject. You really need context for this to understand it.
Boy, is that really true. Well, it's interesting. One of the things that has always been a big tell in the whole Kennedy situation was how they set this guy up to go to Mexico City and pretend he was Oswald. And this is a kind of linchpin of the whole thing, because that guy, whoever he was demanding an exit visa to Cuba and saying, making all these wild statements. So when we look at it and we see the different elements in the records relating to that story, because the official version is that the CIA, their cameras failed that day and they didn't take pictures, just on the one day that Oswald showed up and made all these demands. So there are recordings of that, there are photos of that person and all the rest. So those things have been held back. If those pictures come out and it's not Oswald, then the whole Mexico City demanding a visa and all that, the Patsy thing becomes that much more apparent. So that's the power that we can get from some of these files coming out. And I'm very curious what we're going to discover in that I want to say this. This is a quote from Professor Scott, and this is what he has to say about the deep state. Two kinds of power can be discerned at work in the Byzantine processes of American politics. In the American deep state, I use two terms from Hannah Arendt to describe them: persuasion through arguments versus coercion by force and violence. In another essay, Arendt wrote that only the former was true power. Violence and power, i.e. persuasive power, are not the same. Power and violence are opposites, where the one rules absolutely, the other is absent. One can add that a persuasive politics is one of openness, whereas a violent politics is usually shrouded in exclusion and secrecy. The distinction is both extremely important and hard to define precisely. A number of other opposing terms can be used that are roughly but not exactly conterminous. Arendt herself also writes of top-down and bottom-up power, others of egalitarian or democratic versus oppressive power. It is clear that top-down power is not always violent, just as democratic power is not always nonviolent. However, the terms persuasive and bottom-up and democratic, even if not synonymous or exactly correct, help us to focus on a Socratic ideal of influence by persuasion that has, through the centuries, been a lodestar for Western civilization. By contrast, the opposites, violence, top-down, repressive, epitomize what I believe civilization should be moving away from. And it's very interesting because he goes on to show how the deep state and the Kennedy assassination are the epitome of the top-down shadow version of power, and that the American political landscape became deformed by the Kennedy assassination. This is a crucial understanding. And so getting to the other side of it and showing who was involved and how it was a cover-up after the fact, you might be able then to smooth out that fabric. And this is how important this case can be when it comes up. So never let it be forgot. Once there was a Camelot. What do you got?
A lot of people are asking where they can find the files.
Right at the National Archives, and I'll post the link on our Twitter X account, a Dark Journalist, and yeah, that's it. So what do you got? What are your super chatters?
Super chatters. Here we go. Okay, starting at the beginning. Eurythmy is fun. John Matthews, Debbie McAdoo, IMI and I, Audra Warless, Donald Smead, Blackhawk 7, Adam Smith, Driz T 20011, Sick of the BS, Jason Finlow, Emerilla Gunrunners, Clubs, Steven, Scott, Have a Nice Day, Honey, Honey Bear, Mark Lingerfelt, The Bikini Truther, Aussie in Japan, Robert Scott, Erica Swenson Elliott, Black Tie, Just in Case 008, Christopher, Professor Hamamoto, and Tommy Van Gompel. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Wow, fantastic. We really appreciate your support on this program and for all the work we have ahead of us. It helps a great deal. We will be back with you on Friday with a full report on the new files that have just come out. And there's going to be this is going to be a long process of getting to the root of it. So we're going to do a number of shows bringing the files forward. And we look forward to you joining us with that. I'll do a couple of shout outs here before we go. Scarlet Fire, Al Kiter, David Murphy, Corky Goss, Joseph Tugas. Power comes from the barrel of a gun. Chairman Mao. Whoa, yeah, unfortunately, China found that out when he got in power. Great show, DJ. Thank you. Lever Action Gypsy. Esoteric Gold, Warriors of Truth. Play a dangerous game, but it is in those times the game must be played. Let your light shine bright. That's a great one. Very nice. Professor, somebody is talking to Professor Hamamoto is out there. It's good to see you, sir. Al Kiter. Who else we got? Ultra Heat Seeker. Thanks, DJ and Miss Olivia. Ideas from, Miss Olivia. Bravo. Nicely done. Very good job. Wow, that was a lot of juggling in there tonight too.
They really put me through it tonight.
And it's only Tuesday.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Jessica Rodriguez, best episode to date. Truth finally comes out. Can you believe it? I mean, it's funny because, we should take a moment and celebrate the records coming out. Just, really, how many years has this been in the making? It is an incredible event on that level. Watch out. Great night, guys. Najat, it's always great to see you. And who else we got? Scarlet Fire, jazz singer. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for being out there. Fantastic. Wow. I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. Tim Houston. I've read a couple of books about Dornberger's reprieve from the hangman's noose. Thanks to von Braun, I assume Nuremberg is this. Yes, Judgment at Nuremberg. He saved him from it. And, he had used slave labor to build the V-2 rockets. So that's literally what he was being put to death over. So, yeah, I mean, it's kind of amazing that von Braun saved him. Mary Marie Povich, good job, DJ and Olivia. Love yous. Keep up the good work. Thanks so much. And I always enjoy your comments. Have a good night, Olivia. Let's see. Who else we got? Karen Carpenter. DJ, remember to eat well and get plenty of sleep this week.
Oh,
Indeed,
right
yeah. Yeah, it's there's going to be a lot to get through here, but I have a feeling that this is going to pay off rather remarkably in terms of where the plateau of information rises to, because it's been repressed for so long. And who knows, maybe if the committee can take the leads from the work that we do sifting out the documents, that committee could turn into something remarkable. Remember, these committees, again, I want to say to everyone, they only last for a very short time, and very often the whole thing gets shut down after a short period of time. That window of opportunity is important. So we'll pay attention as it happens. Christmas comes early this week, DJ and Olivia. Thank you, John. Oh, it's great. And Caritas Tarots, it's epic and potent. Potent is the term. You got it exactly. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great Tuesday night, and we will see you back here on Friday.
God bless everybody.
Wow. It says end broadcast, but after all,
never really ends.
It never really ends. We'll see you all on Friday, and have a great evening, everyone. Bravo to the entire apparatus of Tulsi Gabbard and President Trump and others, making sure that these records see the light of day, and they are now coming out to the public, which is where they should be after the CIA has held them for 62 years. You think maybe they have a problem? They probably do, yeah. I would say so. So have a great night, everyone. Thank you so much.